Hey biology students, it's me, Mrs. Willis, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the basics of evolution. So this little mini lecture will give you an introduction into evolution, and hopefully at the end of this lecture, you'll know a little bit more about the content of evolution. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. One of the things you may be asking yourself right now is, what is evolution? I keep hearing this word, but I'm not quite comfortable as to what it is. Well, evolution is the change of a species over time, or the change of population over time. And this is based on the fundamental principle that the modern day organisms that we have here on Earth, they descended from past organisms. And you probably have heard this name before. Charles Darwin was really an important figure in evolution, not because he discovered evolution or he invented it, but because he was able to describe how evolution works. So how is it that species can change through time? And his mechanism for this change is called natural selection, and we'll talk more about that at the end of this lecture. When comparing organisms of the past to organisms that exist today, a pattern does arise. There's a very clear pattern, and that is that organisms that existed in the way past, they tend to be quite simple and not as complex as what we see today. So they do usually have simplified structures and simplified functions. However, looking at today's organisms, you'll notice they're quite complex. We did develop into multicellular organisms, and it is thought that these simple life forms paved the way for more complex things that we see today. When talking about evolution and the change of a species through time, it's really important that you understand the definition of a species. So a species is its own group of individuals that can obviously mate and reproduce, but the key is they have to produce what are called viable offspring. So that means the offspring have to have the capability of reproducing themselves. And so when that happens, then you classify organisms as their own species. Now, obviously, you can see here in the pictures, panda mating with panda, they would create panda offspring, and those offspring could have offspring. They would have viable babies, right? The pandas would produce more babies. Now, of course, you know there are things in nature that may try to mate with one another, but that doesn't mean they're going to produce offspring. And even if they produce offspring, it doesn't mean they'll be viable. So species and evolution, it's important that you know the difference, because evolution is the change of species over time. And so what is a species? A group of individuals that are the same, that can reproduce and make viable offspring. And of course, there's this man. So his name is Charles Darwin, and he was really influential in describing how evolution works. He didn't come up with evolution, but he did come up with a mechanism to describe how things change through time. He was English. He was from the Great Britain area. And in 1831, as a young man, he decided to hop on a boat. The boat was called the HMS Beagle. And on that boat, he served as a naturalist. So he went around the entire world, and he stopped at various islands, and he documented his findings. And of course, he collected specimens, and he brought them home to England in 1836 and started studying to try to explain why the creatures on this earth were so diverse. So that's something he noticed when he went around the world. He's like, wow, there's a lot of different species and they all look really different. I wonder how that happened. And so from his journey and from his voyage, he started trying to piece together that puzzle of how things did change over time. One of the places that Charles Darwin spent a lot of time at was the Galapagos Islands. So this is an island chain. It's located off the coast of Chile, and it is home to many species. And at this location, he saw some very distinct and unique creatures. And again, that kind of led him to wonder why did those species exist there? And so one of the species he saw was the Galapagos tortoise. And on these different islands, he noticed there were tortoises on a lot of the islands, but their necks were different length. So on some of the islands, the tortoises have very short necks. And on other islands, he noticed that they had very long necks. So he was, of course, perplexed by this and was trying to figure out why. Why would that happen if they were all tortoises? He also saw marine iguanas. And of course, this is really strange, right? Because iguanas tend to be a land animal. And this was the first time he actually saw that iguanas could swim. So a very unique creature existed on this island. And I think the big one that you probably experienced in middle school was his research on the finch. And again, so he saw these finches on the Galapagos Islands, but he noticed there were differences between some of the finches on the islands. And those differences were their beak shape and size. So he noticed on some islands, the birds had definitely like short and stocky beaks that were probably really good for eating seeds. And on other islands, he noted the finch beaks were a little bit longer and skinnier, which were probably good for eating insects. So again, he questioned why? Why do these finches have different beaks if they look pretty much like they're all from the same species? After his voyages and he came home and started looking at all his data and research, he began working on his book. And the book was called The Origin of Species. And this, of course, was published in 1859. In his book, he described how he thought things changed over time. And he comes up with the idea of modern descent. That means that organisms that are present today probably descended from organisms that existed in the past. Now, this was a revolutionary idea because remember, during his time, there was a heavy focus on religion. And so many people believed that God put the creatures on earth. And he obviously, too, was raised in a religious household. So that's what he was taught to believe. So coming out and saying, no, the species that are here now came from species that existed a while ago, kind of contradicted what the religious community believed. Something that was also discussed in his book is that evolution takes a long time to do. So this is not something that we see happen overnight. Species don't just change overnight. The process is extremely slow. He also noticed that if an organism had traits that helped them survive, then they would pass on those traits to their offspring, and he termed those organisms fit. So organisms that are well adapted to their environment, they are termed fit. Now, tying into our MRSA case study with Addie, and of course we saw Marshall last class, you could pretty much say that MRSA is becoming extremely fit, right? It's evolving through time. It's resistant to many of our antibiotics, thus helping it survive and obviously reproducing and passing that on to their offspring. So we would term MRSA fit, or we could say it has Darwinian fitness. Organisms that are not fit, they tend to go extinct. So extinct means that they're no longer around here on Earth. And this is because those organisms didn't have the traits that enabled them to survive. Now, the woolly mammoth, for example, that was an environmental change that caused that extinction. However, things like the dodo and the passenger pigeon, those were human caused, and those organisms could not adapt quick enough in order to survive and to be able to pass on their traits to their offspring. That brings us to adaptations. So an adaptation is a trait that allows an organism to become better suited for their environment. The trait can be physical or it can be behavioral. And what's important to note is that an organism cannot choose its adaptations, okay? It's born with what it has, and if those traits that it possesses are beneficial, then they will survive and they will pass on those traits to their offspring. If they don't, if they're not successful, those traits that they already possess, then it usually leads to their extinction. So how do you know which traits are the best and which ones aren't? It really just comes down to the environment. Okay, the environment will choose for you which organisms are best and which ones are not. So the last take-home message here is if an organism is adapted to its environment, it will survive and it will pass its adaptations through genetic code to its offspring. If it hasn't adapted, if it doesn't have those traits that help them survive in their environment, then it will most likely die and those traits will die with it. They won't be passed on. And of course, this whole idea is what Darwin termed natural selection. Nature is selecting, nature is choosing which organisms have the traits that help them survive for their environment. Remember, this is not something that the organism can choose for itself. It has to be determined by the environment. So natural selection is how Darwin describes how things change through time. If nature is selecting that you have the good adaptations and you have the good traits, then you're going to survive and your traits are going to become more popular in the population. And of course, those will be passed on to the offspring until the environment changes and those adaptations are no longer good.